We're going to do the Federal Aviation Veteran and Transition and Improvement Act of 2016 first. So Mr. Lobiano, maybe Mr. Larson will catch up.
Yeah.
I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Aviation Subcommittee and call up H.R. 5957, and that be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there any objection? That objection so ordered. H.R. 5957, the FAA Veteran Transition Improvement Act, provides a much-needed and much-deserved benefit to newly hired veteran employees of the FAA. This is sick time benefit. The sick time benefit is already enjoyed by newly hired veterans throughout the government. This bill will make it easier for FAA employees to seek treatment for wounds and ailments sustained in the service of our nation. I appreciate the bipartisan work of Ranking Member Larson and Chairman Lobiano on this bill. And with that, I recognize Subcommittee Chairman Lobiano to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 5957, the FAA Veteran Transition Improvement Act, is a common-sense piece of legislation that extends an important federal benefit to newly hired veterans at the FAA. When the Wounded Warriors Federal Leave Act was passed last year, it inadvertently excluded FAA employees from coverage. This bill corrects that oversight. Mr. Chairman, one-third of those veterans who served after September 11th report having service-connected disability, with more than two-thirds of those disabilities rating 30% or higher. This bill will help ensure that these and other veterans with service do not become a barrier to future employment. I want to take particular time to thank Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson and I have partnered on a number of measures. This was one that was very common sense, and I want to thank Rick for, once again, his leadership and partnership in helping to get this done. And I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 5957, and I yield back my time.
Thank the gentleman. And with that, I recognize Mr. DeFazio for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Lobiando, Ranking Member Larson, you, Mr. Chairman. We all support this. As Chairman Lobiando pointed out, this was a technical oversight. The intention of Congress was to cover all hires who are veterans, who have service-connected disabilities, but as the act was written, there was an oversight in that FAA employees do not fall under the same title of the U.S. Code. So we're rectifying that matter here today. This is an excellent bill, and I recommend it to my colleagues.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, I would just add to those comments about Mr. Larson's work on this. He is the lead sponsor of this bill, and it was an oversight, and so I look forward to getting this passed and into law to make sure that we take care of our veterans, give them the same benefits that other veterans serving in the government have. So without seeing any other amendments, and Mr. Larson is not here, we will now consider the bill for amendment. I recognize Mr. Lobiano for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 5957 be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will now consider H.R. 5977, which provides Congress advance notice of certain DOT announcements. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Highways and Transit Subcommittee and call up H.R. 5977, and that be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I want to commend Chairman Graves for all the work he's put into this bill, and I also want to thank Ranking Member DeFazio for his work on this important legislation to ensure the committee receives full notice of important DOT announcements. So I urge all members to support H.R. 5977 and now recognize Chairman Graves to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 5977, it's really pretty simple. This committee authorizes the funding for federal transportation programs, which in turn obviously provides the funding and credit assistance for transportation projects all over the country. A lot of times the problem is the committee doesn't consistently get advance notice from the Department of Transportation prior to the announcement of these grant awards and credit assistance projects. So what this bill does is require the department to give the committee at least 3 days advance notice prior to announcing grant awards and credit assistance for projects. It's going to assist the committee tremendously when it comes to the oversight responsibilities, and I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 5977.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the Ranking Member DeFazio for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is, again, a oversight in the FAST Act, which was a good bipartisan piece of legislation. The most job-producing bill to come out of this Congress. The Department of Transportation, unfortunately, needs to be reminded that we are the Committee of Jurisdiction. We wrote the law, we authorized it, and we reserve the right to oversee the discretionary grants that they might make. So this corrects that oversight, and I recommend it to my colleagues.
Do any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, we will now consider the bill for amendment. I recognize Mr. Graves for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would move that H.R. 5977 be approved and reported favorably to the House of Representatives.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will now consider H.R. 5978, the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Amendment Act of 2016. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Coast Guard Subcommittee and call up H.R. 5978, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. If there is an objection, that objection so ordered. I want to commend Chairman Hunter for all the work he has put into the bill, that this gives direction to the Coast Guard on major acquisitions programs and on actions related to non-federal construction of aids to navigation. Further, it provides assistance to the fishing industry, modifies Coast Guard reporting requirements, and makes technical changes to the provisions enacted in the Coast Guard authorizations. It establishes a backup system for GPS. Such a system would allow planes to keep flying and cell phones to keep working if the GPS goes down. I appreciate the minority's cooperation on reaching a bipartisan agreement on this measure, and I now recognize Subcommittee Chairman Hunter to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank Mr. Garamendi from California, my partner in this and colleague. We really worked hard on it, and just really appreciate all his work. H.R. 5978, the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Amendments Act of 2016, contains provisions relating to requirements of the Coast Guard, certain maritime-related issues, and technical corrections to enacted Coast Guard authorization bills. The bill is bipartisan and should be non-controversial. Title I of the bill includes direction for the Coast Guard on its major acquisition programs and a technical correction for language included in the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2015 regarding payments from the Coast Guard to the Navy for health care services. The title repeals a GAO report regarding disbursements from the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. This was a request made by GAO, and the information that was collected in the GAO report will be incorporated into an existing Coast Guard report. The title also includes a section that addresses concerns regarding the Coast Guard's ability to issue prescribed alternative safety compliance program for fishing vessels by January 1st, 2017. The language retains a 3-year window for fishing vessel owners to comply with such a program, the 3 years coinciding with whenever the Coast Guard issues the prescribed program. Title I also includes a one-time report on a Coast Guard pier in Wilmington, North Carolina that collapsed during Tropical Storm Hermine. The National Positioning, Navigation, and Timing, Resilience, and Security Act of 2016 is the last section of Title I. It requires the Commandant of the Coast Guard to issue and maintain a reliable land-based positioning, navigation, and timing system to complement and back up the GPS that we have now to ensure the continuous availability of uncorrupted or non-degraded signals for military and civilian users. I again commend the ranking member, Garamendi, specifically on this provision. If not for him, it probably wouldn't be pushed and have gone through like this. Title II of the bill contains a provision that requires the Coast Guard to issue a certificate of documentation with the coastwise endorsement for the sailing vessel Apollonia. The vessel is U.S.-owned, is U.S.-owned, and was built in the United States, but it was not issued any documentation due to its use as a recreational vessel. Title II would also allow the Commandant, subject to appropriations, to reimburse a non-federal entity for costs incurred by an entity to construct and establish an aid to navigation that facilitates safe and efficient marine transportation on a federally authorized navigation channel. The section provides specific conditions under which the Commandant can reimburse an entity. It limits reimbursements for a single project of $5 million, and the authority expires 4 years after the date of enactment of the bill. And lastly, the last section of the bill contains technical corrections to provisions enacted in Coast Guard authorization acts. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the bill, which I will explain at the appropriate time. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for explaining the bill, and thank you for all your hard work on this. I now recognize Ranking Member DeFazio for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chairman of the subcommittee, and particularly Ranking Garamendi, on the issue regarding a backup for the GPS, something that has long been recognized as a vulnerability, and unfortunately has not led to any decisive action. So the provisions in this bill mandating we move forward with a backup system are long overdue and very, very important. Secondly, I strongly support the provisions regarding the Alternative Safety Compliance Program. The fishing fleets need adequate time to deal with any new regulations, and given the fact that it appears the Coast Guard will be late with the regulations, we need these provisions to give them adequate time to comply. And then finally, the amendment, I strongly support the subcommittee chairman's amendment authorizing 3 heavy icebreakers. The United States is headed toward a point in the not-too-distant future where we're going to be having to call the Chinese or the Russians when we need to deal with an emergency that involves heavy ice. That's totally unacceptable for a maritime nation, and we need to move forward with a new heavy icebreaker program, and I congratulate those involved in this effort. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Subcommittee Ranking Member Mr. Garamundi for a statement.
Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I ask that my statement be entered into the record. And as I move forward, I really want to express my thanks to my colleagues. This subcommittee is a great example of how we can work together, bipartisan way, to really solve some of the significant issues that are out there. The timing and navigation issue is now moving forward, as are the icebreakers. It's a great example of what can be done. None of that would happen without a terrific staff, and so to all the staff, a big thank you. This is a good piece of work. I want to thank Chairman Hunter for his cooperation and his leadership on all of this. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman again. Thank you, Mr. Garamundi, for your work on this bill and others. We've moved forward with your input. It's been very, very helpful, so I appreciate that greatly. Do any of their members wish to be heard? Seeing none, we'll now consider the bill for amendment. The chairman recognizes Mr. Hunter for an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I have an amendment at the desk. I ask unanimous consent the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, offered by Mr. Hunter.
Mr. Hunter is now recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment does a few things. It makes a technical correction to Section 101, the Coast Guard Major Acquisition Program section, removing a conforming amendment that references repealed Section 569A. The amendment would require the Coast Guard to conduct a formal rulemaking, conduct an economic impact study, and report to the relevant committees in Congress before it approves an alternative planning criteria for vessel response plans for an area smaller than the area covered by Western Alaska's captain of the port zone. The amendment also modifies Section 202 to clarify that appropriations funding should be provided in advance of a non-federal entity being reimbursed for a project to establish an aid to navigation. And the last provision in the amendment would make the Commandant of the Coast Guard, would provide the Commandant of the Coast Guard with the authority to make acquisitions through the use of block buy contracts, incremental funding, combined purchases, or economic order quantity purchase and advanced construction funding. All of these things that are provided right now for the Navy, and the Coast Guard would have them too. This is a good bipartisan amendment, Mr. Chairman, and I urge members to support it. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Young from Alaska is recognized.
I'd like to address a question to the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Hunter. On line 16, B may enter into a contract for acquisition of polar icebreakers, except that the total number of icebreakers acquired under this section may not exceed 6. Everybody knows in this committee what I've been promoting all these years is we're not going to get the money to build these icebreakers. Not $1.4 billion to build one. And I've said, okay, if we can't build one, immediately now we ought to be able to lease one. And I've said this up front, and everybody knows it. We ought to have that capability as long as we have icebreakers on the scene. So I won't offer an amendment, but I'd suggest respectfully to the chairman as we go forth with this bill, let's look at that section line, may enter into a contract for additional icebreakers, and eliminate the word acquisition, because my interpretation, acquisition means that you buy it. And I just don't think we're going to appropriate the money for buying a vessel. So I just like to have a comment from the chairman.
Sure. Thank you. Number one, I have no problem taking out the word acquisition. Number two, I would like to let it be known right now that it's a sense of our subcommittee and the full committee that if you acquire something through a lease, it's still an acquisition, and that includes leasing them. That is our interpretation of the word acquisition.
Okay, so, but if we go forth, we could eliminate that word, couldn't?
Yes.
Yes, we could. So as we work on this bill, we'll work on that.
Yes, I just weigh in a little bit on it. I believe now they have the ability to lease, as we have a problem, an OMB problem, as Mr. DeFazio has so accurately pointed out. The trolls at OMB are causing this problem. It probably makes more sense to lease these things, to be able to get them, to be able to afford to do it.
And that's something we can address, but I don't want to leave this, Mr. Chairman, in law. Acquisition under interpretation means to purchase.
Right.
Not to lease.
Right.
So I want to make sure that as we go through with this, that they don't hang their hat on, we had this hearing before.
Right.
They don't hang their hat on the word that Congress said we have to acquire. Everybody understand that?
Yeah,
Okay.
understand.
With that, I have no more. You
All right,
back.
thank the gentleman. Anybody else wish to be heard on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, in inquiry, can we strike the word acquisition right now with unanimous consent?
Staff? What's the hangup?
Am I-
We've got this scored by CBO to try to get this bill to the floor in short order. If we amend this language, CBO may score it significantly differently, and the bill may not be able to be brought to the floor.
All right. So let's get it out, let's get it to the floor. Again, I think the longer-term problem, and we have this problem all the time at OMB, it just, as Mr. DeFazio pointed out, is absolutely unacceptable for a maritime nation that has interest in both the Arctic and the Antarctic to not have a capacity for heavy icebreakers. So,
We can change that, though, the OMB.
well, we can, but we've got to get the other side of the Capitol to be on board to make sure we push this thing
And
to
we
get
might
it
as
done.
well all go home.
Well, I say we move forward with this, and let's keep on working on it. With that, Mr. Garamonti's recognized.
I'd recommend we leave the language as it is and then consider a floor amendment to add the word lease in the floor. To remove the word acquisition here may wind up negating what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think
So
that's a,
let's work through that, and as the Chairman said, it is his interpretation that acquisition could mean lease as well as purchase.
and I appreciate Mr. Garamonti. I think it's a wise strategy moving forward, and we can do that.
Mr. Chairman, if I
Working. Yes, sir,
just
Mr.
weigh in
DeFazio.
on that, what we want is the most cost-effective, most expeditious way of acquisition, which could include a range in my mind, and I certainly think we can work that out as we go to the floor. But I don't want to preclude anything. I get tired of getting rolled by OMB, and and then we also have problems with GSA, where we're leasing things, where we would more cost-effectively actually have federal ownership. I mean, we need to make sure it's cost-effective and efficient acquisition. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, are there any other amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Seeing none, I recognize Mr. Hunter for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 5978 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The bill is amended and is approved in order reported favorably to the House. We will now consider S-546, the Response Act of 2016. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Railroad Subcommittee and call up S-546, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I want to commend Chairman Denham for all of his work he has put into this bill. With so many communities having crude by rail and other hazmats being transported in or around them, it's important that we continue efforts to ensure the safety of citizens living within our districts. This bill helps advance safety measures by further improving training for first responders, handling rail hazmat incidents. Access to relevant, useful, and timely training is a necessary step for our emergency responders in dealing with rail accidents. By evaluating the quality and application of training for local emergency responders, we can improve response time for all our communities to better promote safety. So I support this simple, straightforward approach to improving emergency responder training, and I now recognize Chairman Denham to explain the bill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your kind words, as well as all of your hard work on this bill. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Kind and Senator Heitkamp for introducing this bill. The Response Act establishes the Rail Emergency Services Preparedness Operational Needs and Safety Evaluation. The Response Act tasks a subcommittee of experts, both government and non-government, to develop recommendations to improve emergency responder training for hazardous materials and incidents involving railroads. It requires the evaluation of a number of topics related to rail hazmat incidents, including the quality and application of training for local emergency first responders. Additionally, to look at overlap in training and ways to modernize training for emergency responders, especially those in small communities like mine. Rail safety is critical to the transportation of goods and services throughout our country. As chair of the Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials Subcommittee, I've consistently worked to improve the safety of transporting hazardous materials by rail, especially crude by rail. Specifically in PREA and later the FAST Act, this committee mandated robust response plans and adopted strong national standards for transporting hazardous materials by rail. Additionally, we've held several bipartisan hearings at both the full and subcommittee level to examine how Congress can improve upon what is already a very safe rail network. Finally, I personally have facilitated training for dozens of first responders in my district to ensure they have the training needed to respond in the unlikely event of an accident involving hazardous materials transported by rail. This bill is aimed at further improving the safety of responses to rail hazmat incidents. I saw how important this hands-on training can be over August when I traveled to the Transportation Technology Center in Pueblo with my colleagues Capuano and Farenthold, where they train emergency responders for tank car incidents. I believe that this bill will succeed in building upon the safety of our rail network for communities across the country. I again thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Kind, and Senator Heitkamp for working on this bill.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. DeFazio for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, there's a saying among firefighters, train as if your life and others depend upon it, because it does. Training's critical, yet only 65% of all fire departments have not formally trained all their personnel on how to respond to hazardous materials incidents. And with more and more hazmat being transported by rail, which is generally the safest way to transport hazardous materials, this legislation is very important. We need to make sure that our first responders have the training they need, and also through other provisions of law, we have to make certain that the materials that they need to properly fight these fires are also readily available, and I have legislation that would address that issue. So this is a step forward toward the safety of all Americans, and I recommend it to my colleagues.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to thank also Mr. Capuano, who's not here, for his hard work on this and his input on this important piece of legislation. I had the privilege back in the spring to visit with or see Norfolk Southern has a rolling classroom. They roll into the community. They've got a couple of tank cars. They've got a classroom on it where they can bring the first responders on and train them right there. And it's really an excellent program. I understand that I believe CSX, and I'm not sure if UP and BNSF and some of the others, but I think they're all moving in that direction. So I commend the entire rail industry for making this a priority. Do any other members wish to be recognized? We will now consider the bill for amendment. Is there an amendment? We recognize Mr. Denham for his amendment. Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 174, offered by Mr. Capuano and Mr. Denham.
Mr. Denham is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer this on behalf of Mr. Capuano and myself. This amendment improves this bill and is based on feedback we received from members of this committee. We include several changes to the membership of the subcommittee to make sure it is comprised of the most qualified and relevant individuals in both government and industry. It's important that this membership embodies the concerns and observations from different and diverse parties. We also removed and revised several provisions to reduce redundancy within the FAST Act. We also made some changes to comply with our rules here in the House. This is a good amendment that improves this bill, and I want to thank Mr. Capuano and other colleagues, including Mr. DeFazio, on this. great amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be? Mr. DeFazio, please.
Well, I thank the subcommittee chairman for his ringing endorsement of this amendment. And, it does add the chief safety officer of the Pipeline Hazard Safety Materials Administration, someone from rail labor, in addition to the rail industry and persons who offer crude for transportation by rail to this subcommittee. It also clarifies the term emergency responder to include state emergency responders. I think this improves the bill, and I welcome the amendment.
Thank you, gentlemen. Any other members wish to be heard? Seeing none, I also want to commend Chairman Denham and Ranking Member DeFazio for working on this together. I know there's broad support across the committee, but I know throughout industry there's support on this. So I appreciate the gentleman bringing this forward. Is there an amendment to the amendment? Seeing none, the question's on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I now recognize Mr. Denham for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that Senate Bill 546, as amended, be approved and reported favorably.
The question is on the
House.
motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The bill is amended and approved or in order reported favorably to the House. We will now next consider H.R. 5011 to designate the federal building in the United States Courthouse located at 300 Fannin Street in Shreveport, Louisiana, as the Tom Stagg Federal Building and United States Courthouse. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Economic Development Subcommittee and call up H.R. 5011, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without seeing any, so ordered. I now turn to Subcommittee Chairman Barletta.
Thank you, Mr.
Explain the
Chairman. H.R. 5011 would designate the federal building and United States Courthouse in Shreveport, Louisiana as the Tom Stagg Federal Building and United States Courthouse. Judge Stagg served on the United States District Court for the Western District of Louisiana for 41 years until his death last year. I think it is more than fitting to name this courthouse after him. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Is Mr. DeFazio recognize Mr. DeFazio? Any other members wish to be heard? Mr. Carson's recognized.
Chairman, quickly, I also support this bill. Judge Stagg was a World War II veteran and jurist that was universally respected by his peers. I urge my colleagues to join me in advancing this legislation, which honors Judge Stagg for his career in public service. I yield back.
Any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, we will now consider the bill for amendment. The chairman recognizes Mr. Barletta for an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. I ask unanimous consent the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 69, offered by Mr. Barletta.
I now recognize Mr. Barletta to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment would make certain technical changes to the bill, including clarifying the designation as the Tom Stagg United States Courthouse to conform with the current wording on the building. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do any members wish to be recognized on the amendment? Are there any other amendments to the amendment? If not, the question's on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, the amendment, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Seeing none, I recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 5011 as amended be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The bill is amended, is approved, and reported favorably to the House. We will next consider H.R. 5873 to designate the federal building in the United States Courthouse located at 511 East San Antonio Avenue in El Paso, Texas, as the R.E. Thompson Federal Building in the United States Courthouse. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Economic Development Subcommittee and call up H.R. 5873, and that it be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I now ask Mr. Barletta to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 5873 would designate the federal building in the United States Courthouse in El Paso, Texas, as the R.E. Thomason Federal Building and United States Courthouse. Judge Thomason served as a United States District Judge for the Western District of Texas for 26 years. I think it is fitting to name this courthouse after him. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Fazio. Mr. Carson is recognized for a statement.
Thank you, Chairman. I also support this bill, which names the federal building and U.S. Courthouse in El Paso, Texas, after Judge Thomason. I urge my colleagues to join me in advancing this legislation, which honors Judge Thomason for his dedication to the public good. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Do any other members wish to be recognized? We will now consider the bill for amendment. I recognize Mr. Barletta for an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 5873 be approved and reported favorably to the House.
The question is on the motion, and all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The bill is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. We will next consider H.R. 5147, the Bathrooms Accessible in Every Situation or Act, or the Babies Act. I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Economic Development Subcommittee, call up H.R. 5147, and that be considered as read and open amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Then objection so ordered. I now turn to Chairman Barletta to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 5147, the Bathrooms Accessible in Every Situation Act, would require restrooms in public buildings to be equipped with baby changing stations. This requirement would clarify the existing practice of GSA and only apply to facilities that are available for public use. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Carson for a statement.
Thank you, Chairman. I also support this legislation. I'd like to commend my colleague, Mr. Cicilline, for his leadership on this issue. I know that it wasn't an easy issue to undertake, and has worked with me to bring this bill before our committee today. This bill would require GSA to provide baby changing facilities in buildings that the public has access to. This bill codifies existing GSA policy, Mr. Chairman, in new construction and modernization projects and expands it to buildings that GSA leases. Equal access to baby changing stations in federal buildings in both men's and women's bathrooms across the country are essential to protecting the health and safety of children and encouraging a family-friendly environment. All right, I'm trying to pose. That's a good one. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
That's good. I thank the gentleman. Do any members wish to be heard on this bill? Mr. Costello is recognized.
Very good bill. I wish to applaud those who spearheaded the effort.
I thank the gentleman. We will now consider the bill for amendment. I recognize Mr. Carson for an amendment.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. My amendment makes several technical changes and clarifications to the language. The amendment narrows the number of restrooms that are included in this requirement to provide a baby changing station by limiting it to those controlled by the GSA. The amendment also clarifies that this requirement only applies to buildings that are receiving a major alteration. I support this amendment and urge my colleagues to join me in advancing this legislation, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing none, are there amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments? Seeing none, I recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 5147, as amended, be approved and reported favorably to the House.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The bill is amended and is approved and ordered reported favorably to the House. Finally, we will consider 20 General Services Administration Capital Investment and Leasing Program resolutions. I ask unanimous consent to call up the resolutions in block and that they be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. Is there an objection? Without objection, so ordered. I now recognize Chairman Barletta to explain the resolutions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We are considering 20 GSA resolutions approving projects, 4 courthouse projects, and 16 leases. The potential savings from reducing space is more than $135 million in avoided lease costs. I support approval of these resolutions.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize Mr. Carson for a statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to support 20 GSA resolutions that now authorize new construction and leasing actions across the nation. I look forward to continuing to work with members of this committee and GSA to right-size the federal real estate footprint. I urge my colleagues to support approval of these resolutions, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Any other members wish to be recognized? Seeing none, we will consider the resolution for amendment. Are there any amendments to the resolution? Seeing none, I recognize Mr. Barletta for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the 20 committee resolutions be approved en bloc.
Questions on the motion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The resolutions are approved. I ask unanimous consent that each bill ordered reported today be reported as a single amendment in the nature of a substitute incorporating all amendments adopted. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical clarifying, conforming changes to each of the bills ordered reported today and each committee resolution adopted today to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, has authority to strike or revise any provision of the bills ordered reported today that would cause a sequential referral to another committee, or it would cause the bills to be subject to a Budget Act or Rule 21 cut-go point of order. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman, that the committee authorize the chairman or his designee to offer such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on H.R. 5957, H.R. 5977, H.R. 5978 as amendment, S. 546 as amendment, H.R. 5011 as amended, H.R. 5873, and H.R. 5147 as amended. Order reported by the committee today or similar Senate bills without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 5 of the Rules on the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, the chair notes the presence of a quorum for today's action and all committee business today. I'd finally like to say, as I started off, if you haven't been down to the new Trump International Hotel, I would highly recommend it. It's spectacular. It's a spectacular use of taking a public building, turning it into something that, as Ms. Norton pointed out, they're paying $3 million a year and turned this into a luxury hotel. It's probably going to be the hotel in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue. So a soft opening on Monday, and I would encourage you to go down and check it out. They've utilized the watchtower, or the clock tower, has 250,000 visitors a year, and they've made it so that 250,000 people won't be traipsing through this hotel, but they've got underneath a passageway, has a museum under it that they can go to the clock tower. So it's really a spectacular use of a public building that I believe we all benefit by having something like this. And, oh, by the way, it's been done 1 year before it was supposed to. Mr. Larson, do you have anything to say on this matter, or any matter?
Just wondering if I can march around out front instead.
I'm sure you will be welcome by some. With that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has completed its business for the day, and the committee is adjourned.